Katoa. Greetings everybody to the discussion on the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the role of the UN. Before starting, just a reminder of the event logistics. This is the webinar on demand. Even after the webinar, you will be able to watch this. If you lose your connection, don't worry. This will be recorded and will be emailed to registrants. The event is live on Facebook as well. Namihinu Hiyokatau Hei Hafina Tekopapa E Teneira. Thank you all for coming today to join this important kopapa. I am Wajia Dihetti, and it is a great pleasure to welcome all of you as the President of the United Nations Association of New Zealand Wellington Branch. UNANZ is a membership-based organization, registered charity and a community sector movement. We have 8 branches across the country, including the new branch in Otago. I welcome all of you to join UNANZ activities, and please sign up for our newsletter and have a look into our website. This provoked incident between Russia and Ukraine in the middle of the economic recovery process with the pandemic threw each and every country in the world into a more dire socio-economic state. Not only that, but this war is also hindering the progress made to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030 and the Paris Agreement commitments. Importantly, the concern is with the role of the UN. The Security Council's inability to exercise its primary responsibility to sustain international peace and security, recognize legitimate security concerns of all parties. This discussion is important to UNANZ as we promote engagements with the UN. In this discussion, there is a Q&A session, and you are welcome to share your ideas, insights, and questions. Without further ado, I will hand you over to the chair of the forum, Dr. Nega Pato. Dr. Nega Pato is a senior lecturer in security studies in the Center for Defense and Security Studies at Massey University, Wellington. Her areas of expertise are international security, human security, and philosophy of security. She contributes to UNANZ as a special officer and provides guidance for activities as a senior member of the association. Poatu tera ko kia ko nega.
Papai. Kia ora koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, he aha te manui aota, he tangata, he tangata, he tangata. What is most important in this world? People, the people, the people. And we are gathered together today to discuss the role of the United Nations in the aggression towards Ukraine done by Russia about 5 weeks ago. And I am privileged to be the moderator of this session. So we are very privileged to have a very great group of panelists who are going to share their ideas with us, and I will introduce you to the panelists in the order of their speech. After that, you're more than welcome to write your questions and answers during everybody's presentations in the Q&A section of the Zoom sessions. After the finishing all the presentation, I will come back to the questions and I will present all your questions to the committee members, to the panel members. So we start with the first speaker, Dr. Kennedy Graham. Dr. Kennedy Graham has been a diplomat, university academic, UN official, and member of parliament. He is founding director of the New Zealand Centre for Global Studies, a think tank designed to research and debate global affairs and New Zealand's role within it. He has worked on climate change for 33 years, participating in 6 UN conferences since the Earth Summit in 1992, was chair of Globe New Zealand, a cross-party parliamentary group on climate change from 2015 to 2017, and a consultant to the Productivity Commission for its Low Emissions Economy Inquiry 2017 to 2018. Dr. Kennedy contributes to United Nations Association of New Zealand as the Special Officer of Disarmament and provides guidance and support to United Nations Association of New Zealand activities and is a senior member of the association. Welcome, Dr. Kennedy. Our next speaker is Ms. Tatiana Sanders. Ms. Tatiana Sanders is a postgraduate student at Massey University. She has completed a BA in Defense Studies and History and is now undertaking honors in Defense Studies. He was born and grew up in Ukraine and has a degree in economics from Cherkasy State University in Ukraine. I hope I pronounced it correctly, but you can correct me later. She is the treasurer and one of the co-founders of the Ukrainian Educationalist and Support Trust. Welcome, Tatiana, to our panel. Our next speaker, third speaker, is Mr. Colin Keating. Mr. Colin Keating is a senior New Zealand diplomat who served as a permanent representative of New Zealand to the United Nations from 1993 to 1996 and was on the Security Council from 1993 to 1994. Further, Colin provides guidance and advice to the United Nations Association of New Zealand activities as a senior member of the association. Our last, not least speaker, thank you very much, Professor Patman. Professor Robert Patman is one of the University of Otago's inaugural sesquicentennial distinguished chairs and served as an editor for International Studies Perspectives from 2010 to 2014. And he was a head of Department of Politics from 2013 to 2016 at the University of Otago. His research interests concern international relations, global security, US foreign policy, great powers, and the Horn of Africa. Professor Robert is also an honorary professor of the New Zealand Defence Command and Staff College. Welcome, Professor Patman. Thank you very much, all of you, for taking time to speak with us tonight. Dr. Kennedy, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pato, and kia ora tātou to everybody, and thank you for the invitation to be here. This is quite a challenge for all of us. As individuals, I think, and as a collective, because the passions obviously are running very high and for good reason. What I broadly was asked to do and chose to interpret it in a way that I hope I can make the best contribution I can is to put the current Ukrainian crisis in an historical perspective. Which is in no way to seek to exonerate anybody, but rather to recognize what has happened in the past with a view to allowing us some insights into how we go into the future during this Ukraine crisis and post-crisis as well. Some people may know that Colin and I had collaborated together in a discussion paper about UN renewal, pointing out the shortcomings of the UN and what could be done, hopefully, in the future to renew it. And I think Colin will address that on behalf of us. But so I thought the best thing I can do is to do a retroactive historical presentation. And it's in the context of that I'm doing some research for an article for a yearbook right now anyway. And I'm by no means finished it. So I'm learning as I go. What I'm wanting to do here is to, first off, have regard to the use of the term war, which we use. And if I may use the phrase, bandy about. If one takes a strict legal approach, and one obviously can go beyond that with geopolitical or geostrategic concerns, which I think will be addressed later, and even psychological and cultural and civilizational dimension to crises, of which this is a classic, but not the only one. But if we want to do a strict legal stroke, diplomatic stroke, political interpretation, then it's worth, what I'm wanting to do here is to just review, obviously briefly, the term war and its status in historical terminology first, and then proceed from that into what else we should be using as terminology now in the contemporary, 3/4 of a century old contemporary multilateral order, which basically gets us onto the concepts, two concepts, essentially the concept of aggression and the concept of the breach of the peace, and how those are handled. Because there is an argument that war has been, with respect, expunged from legal terminology in international law, and the terminology now is simply either the legal or the lawful, depending on your preference, lawful use of force and the unlawful use of force. So if we look at let's say 10 millennia of war, and then let us say in the last couple of hundred years, certainly in the 19th century, attempts geostrategically to keep war at bay through diplomatic and political alliances, balance of power. But war was there. And it wasn't really 1907, but it really wasn't until the League of Nations Covenant that we introduced the notion of collective security and to stop war, and that settlement, Pacific settlement, would be the primary first route to go, but collective security with the sanctioned, legally sanctioned resort to force on a collective basis in response to war was established in the League of Nations Covenant, but it did not completely expunge war, because there is an article that says that if you do all your best efforts at Pacific settlement or judicial settlement and it is not adequate, you can, quote, resort to war at 3 months' notice. So it was halfway there. The 1928 treaty, Kellogg-Briand Pact, did have a total renunciation of war for the first time. It didn't actually say that war was a criminal offense. It said that states, parties to the convention, renounced war, which is close. But I think it really has to be recognized that it's 1945 with the Charter, where war has been, quote, expunged from strict legal terminology. And I personally think that's hugely important to acknowledge. And I personally think it's a shame that we continue to use the word war, because it gets us back to, you like, 19th century and prior to that. But there would be a lot of people who may argue the toss on that. But I prefer to go down the route of lawful and unlawful use of force since 1945. Point one. Next question that arises from that is, what does that mean? What is the illegal use of force? And I think you look to the UN Charter, and there are two essential concepts: aggression on the one hand, and breach of the peace. Breach of the peace is a broader thing in which you do not necessarily identify an aggressor. Obviously, an act of aggression under the UN Charter, you do, although, yes, you do. So the next question is, well, definition of, especially of aggression. And there is a history of efforts since 1933, and actually before that, on defining aggression. And interestingly enough, and it is interesting, it was the USSR that took the lead in 1933 with other East European states to develop a definition of aggression, and it was reasonable as well. But in the contemporary multilateral era, since 45, there were attempts through the 50s and so on with various special groups. But the General Assembly in 1973 emerged with a definition of aggression in Resolution 3314. And it became the standard definition, go-to definition for aggression, and it's pretty sound. But it has to be, and quote, that was for the guidance of the Security Council from the General Assembly, and it pertains to state responsibility, and it is a political diplomatic term. It was not as in legal as such, but very valuable since 1973. And then, of course, there is an entirely different area of analysis for international criminal law, with the Rome Statute in 1998 and the International Criminal Court, with 4 major crimes of greatest concern to the international community, and one of which is aggression. So you could say that in 1998, the world became conscious of aggression as a criminal offense of an individual. And in the case of aggression, as opposed to the other 3, a leadership individual crime. So we are starting to get there. Well, that was 1998. The court came into force, the statute in the court in 2002. But unlike the other 3 crimes, aggression was deferred until 2 things, a legal definition of aggression and the arrangements for jurisdictional relative competence between the Security Council and the court and the prosecutor. And that took until 2010, the Kampala Amendment Conference, when there was a legal definition that was agreed upon against expectations. And it's not unlike the political definition of 1973, but it's there in legal form. And for reasons we don't have to go into, it took another 7 years for a further second affirmative decision by the ICC states parties, at which you got 75% majority, which then introduced aggression as a justiciable crime, and that came into force in, from memory, July 2018. So we now have a legal definition of aggression as an individual leadership crime since July 2018, but only for those countries. Now you've got some, if I remember it right, 123 countries that are states parties to the ICC, and I think only 43 that have agreed to the definition of aggression. And New Zealand's not one of them, actually, yet. So there we are with the definition of aggression. And where does that leave us now in terms, so that's the theory. Now getting on to the practicalities, and tell me when I've got 5 minutes left and I'll go at the speed of light. There you go. So going backwards, we start with Ukraine. And as we all know, the Security Council had a veto, funny that. And so the draft resolution was vetoed, but then there was a second resolution referring it to the General Assembly for a special session. And there was an emergency special session, which adopted the virtually the definition, the same resolution. And it does the following, quote, deplores in the strongest terms the aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine, demands Russia cease its use of force against Ukraine, demands Russia immediately, completely, unconditionally withdraw all its military forces, and also withdraws its recognition of the status of Donetsk and Luhansk. Those are the essential issues. Another resolution on humanitarian. So you have a General Assembly special session resolution that has used aggression. So that's Ukraine. And I think everybody would tick that, except for some states, and quite a number, a significant number, and significantly large. We don't have to go down that at the moment, but it was by no means universal. So what about the history of that kind of thing, to put an identification of aggression by Ukraine in 2022 into historical perspective? And this is what I've been devoting my time to recently. And as far as I can see, it amounts to the following. The Security Council seems to have, subject to further confirmation, seems to have identified aggression explicitly only in 2 cases, Southern Rhodesia aggression against Zambia, 1979, and with South Africa in collusion, supporting rebels. So that's Southern Rhodesia, which was not regarded as a nation state or a member state of the UN at that stage, against Zambia, 1979. Secondly, 1988, Israel against Tunisia on 2 occasions, in April 88 and in October 88. Use of the word aggression.
You have 10 minutes. Sorry.
Sorry, say it again.
You have 10 minutes.
Okay, thanks. I think that's just about right. So those are 2 occasions for the Security Council. There are 2 occasions where an emergency special session of the UN has used aggression. The most recent one is the second one, 2022 Ukraine. Before that, in 1981, South Africa against Namibia used the word aggression. So I think the lesson here is that the essential legal terminology of aggression, with great respect to the individual leadership crime for 43 countries at the moment, and we could go into that, but for 150 odd, it is simply state responsibility through the Security Council of the UN at the political level, and it's only been used on 4 occasions over 76 years. So what about all the others? Well, we certainly don't have time to go through every other one, but here's a few, just by way of example of not using aggression. 1950 Korea, the phrase breach of the peace, which is adequate because, as I said earlier, it's a matter of not, for whatever reason, and there are reasons sometimes, not to identify an individual. So Korea, 1950, breach of the peace. 1956, Suez, quote, Israel's armed forces have penetrated deeply into Egyptian territory. And France and UK have engaged in military operations in Egypt. So you're identifying countries, but they did not use the word aggression. They didn't say breach of the peace. They just gave a descriptive analysis of what was going on. 1956, Hungary, armed attack by USSR, which in a sense amounts, in normal parlance, you would say that's aggression, but they did not use the word. And we're talking here about the emergency sessions because those have been vetoed. 1956 Suez was vetoed in the Security Council. US draft vetoed by France and UK, and Israel, France and UK. Hungary, obviously, 1956 vetoed by USSR. So we're talking about reference to the emergency special sessions of the General Assembly. 1980, Afghanistan, quote, foreign armed intervention. They don't even identify the country. But it is deplored. And then there's all sorts of ideas about how to stop, cease, withdraw, peacemaking and peacekeeping, et cetera, but not the word aggression. 1990, classic one of the legitimate use of force sanctioned by the UN Security Council, 1990, quote, Iraq invasion of Kuwait, which amounts to a breach of the peace. So you've got, it's interesting, you have the identity, but a broader concept rather than aggression. And the final thing, and I'll stop at this point, is comparing 1990 Iraq invasion of Kuwait and the response led by the US, but not vetoed by anybody, and a legitimate UN Security Council sanctioned use of force against Iraq with the lead state, US and many others, stopping at the border on the grounds that the US president and others were of the view, I think correctly, that the 660 and subsequent resolutions did not justify and sanction use of force there was certainly armed combat and conflict, but there was not an invasion of Iraq as such. Compared with the 2003 case with Iraq, where there was an attempt, as you will recall, to get a resolution to sanction use of force against Iraq. Only 4 out of 15 countries were regarded as being ready to support that. US, UK, and Spain, and then I think Bulgaria, and on the Security Council, and at least 2, if not 3 vetoes. So the blue draft was withdrawn, and a coalition went in anyway of US, UK, Australia, and Poland. A year later, the UN Secretary General and many jurists about the SG said that it was, in the view of the Charter and in his view, illegal. So we've got a very vast and challenging history of the use of legal concepts in which Ukraine sits. I mean, you can argue, and I think it's a pretty credible argument, the invasion of Ukraine is, apart from it being such an affront to humanity in the 21st century, and arguably the most egregious example of straight out blatant invasion of another member state of the UN. And it takes us back to the 19th century, actually. But there is a whole area. I just think that it's very, very wise if we put it in the context of where we should be going, in the context of historical insights from a lot of those different places. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kennedy. Ms. Tatiana Sanders, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for joining us today.
May I share my screen? Can you see my screen? Excuse me, can you see my screen?
Yes, yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Dr. Graham, for your speech. But my question is actually about war, the role of women and children in the Russian-Ukrainian war. And I will be using this term war because I believe that since Second World War, Europe hasn't seen anything, any type of conflict like we see today. And I believe war is appropriate terminology in this case, and perhaps later on will be another definition found. Someone will be looking for another definition to find some, yeah, if it's not war, if it's not that, so what is this? So in my case, I will be calling it war. So I would like to, first of all, well, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, women and children played significant role, and there is a need to acknowledge them. I would like to admit the demographics of Ukraine prior to the Russian invasion. During the Second World War, Ukraine has lost a large number of men, and since that time, ratio between
flight has been cancelled too. So he doesn't know, but
Sorry.
he just.
Mr. Keating, sorry, would you please mute your speaker? Thank you. Sorry, Tatiana. Continue.
That's all good. So during the Second World War, the Ukraine has lost very large number of men, and since that time, the ratio between women and men has always been dominant towards women. And this graph is showing the changes of the Ukrainian demographics over the last 20 years. And in 2021, we had 19.2 million males and 22.22 million females. Before the Russian invasion, Ukrainian women had an important role within the society. Majority of women had their jobs, women had their children, and in most cases returned to work soon after having children. With the outbreak of the war, many men took their women and children to the border, either with Poland, Slovakia, Romania, Hungary, or Moldova. Their families became refugees in other countries, but men wanted to keep their families safe and then return to their homes to join the territorial defense or other military roles. On the other hand, majority of women and children stayed in Ukraine and found various roles in support of the war effort. Women who have escaped to the bomb shelters, they have been trying to establish their lives. You can see this on the photo quite clear how they live, and women also given birth in bomb shelters and continuing with their lives. There are women who became volunteers, preparing Molotov cocktails on the left side, like making camouflage nets, also cooking for the Ukrainian army. And on the photo on the right is Marina Poroshenko. She is the wife of the previous Ukrainian president, Pato Poroshenko. So women have joined territorial defense and members of the Ukrainian and become members of the Ukrainian army. Among those, many famous people such as actors, sportswomen, and even politicians. And I would like to show you this short video about Tatiana Chizhan, who is a former journalist and politician, and her and she was activist in 2014 during Euromaidan, and unfortunately her husband was killed in Donbass.
Tatiana, could you also explain it to us? We can't hear the voice. It would be good to have some. No, it doesn't have any audio, so it would be good to if you could speak to us about what's happening. Tatiana? Sorry.
Sorry, I was hoping that that will be the sound will be good, but okay. So in few words, the Tatiana Chizhan is obviously operator, and she is using anti-tank operation system, and she is on the background, and she's the video is basically explaining her life previously, what I just told you before. Yeah, it's just a short video just to give you an insight of how it looks like for Tatiana Chizhan, who is a politician, who is right there on the in the war zone. I can continue with the next slide. So the question becomes, why the Ukrainian women able to endure such a hardship? And I believe that answer to this question entails many horrendous historical events in Ukraine. Among those are the Red Terror between 1918 and 1922. Also Stalin's genocide, famine, the Holodomor between 1932 and 1933. We had Second World War, we had 80 years of communism, economic collapse in the 1990s and after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I also would like to mention the historical figure, Princess Olga of Kiev. This is going back to the 10th century. So Princess Olga of Kiev, she is a national symbol for Ukrainian womanhood. In her life, she suffered much sorrow when her husband was assassinated by one of the neighboring tribes. She committed destruction of that tribe. She was also a fair ruler of the Kievan Rus until her son was old enough to rule. She has considered a saint in the Eastern Orthodox Church because she brought Christianity to Ukraine through her grandson. She was tough, hard-working, fair and pious woman, and became the matriarch of the Ukrainian women. And my final question, what are the considerations for the UN, for the United Nations? And I will be honest here, the United Nations is hopeless in the Russian-Ukrainian war. The United Nations cannot do anything when the Ukrainian hospitals for children and maternity hospitals are bombed. And due to Russia being a permanent member of the Security Council and has the right to veto, it puts the United Nations in the position that they cannot do anything. And Russia was granted the right to veto with the collapse of the Soviet Union. But Ukraine, as a founding member of the United Nations, also had as much claim to the legacy of the Soviet Union. I know that the United Nations today are facing quite a challenging time, and this is due to the United Nations has not experienced yet a full-scale conflict in Europe since the year of its establishment, since 1945. Another challenge for the United Nations is a significant number of refugees in Europe, which is also hasn't been experienced in such a big proportion. It is expected the number of the Ukrainian refugees to be increased up to 8 million of primarily women and children. And I believe that United Nations needs to think carefully of which measures can be applied to help. And possibly the UN needs to urgently, I can underline it, urgently consider such questions like what are the immediate actions that needs to be applied to protect women and children in Ukraine and those who are looking for refuge in Europe. And what are the long-term strategies can be established to protect Ukrainian women and children? However, since the Russian-Ukrainian conflict is an ongoing conflict and it is difficult to predict the final outcome of this conflict, the additional questions needs to be considered as well. What if this war conflict will last for a long time? What if other actors will be involved? What if affected territories will be expanded, including other countries? And in the worst case scenario. What if chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons will be applied? So in this, this will significantly change the course of conflict, and there will be not just women and children who will need protection, but everyone will be needing this protection. And I believe that the United Nations need to be prepared for the worst case scenario, as there will be a threat to the humanity as a whole. Thank you very much for listening. That's all from me.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. Thank you. It was very informative. Thank you very much. The floor is yours, Mr. Colin Keating. Thank you. We're looking forward to hear about your vision of UN Security Council. You're on mute. Sorry, you're on mute. You're still on mute. Sorry. You're still on mute. Oh, now we got.
It's keeping the mute. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good. Kia ora tātou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi nui. I think we all need to reflect very deeply on what Tatiana has just said, not only about the tragedy which is afflicting her homeland, but also about the failure of the global institutions that were established in 1945 and were meant to prevent exactly this sort of aggression taking place. Now, I think that I would like to start with some thoughts about the current reality, some thoughts about the dilemma that exists between, on the one hand, conflict prevention, and on the other hand, the resolution of conflict. Thirdly, I'd like to say some words about what I think could and should have been done prior to the 24th of February in order to prevent the awful situation that we are now in. So, the current reality. I don't need to add much to what Tatiana has said about the humanitarian crisis, about the awful situation of Ukrainian women and children, the huge flow of refugees that has occurred. The UNHCR is telling us that it is the worst flow of refugees in a period of time since the Second World War. We see every night on our television the death and destruction. I saw an estimate recently that already perhaps more than $49 billion worth of damage has been caused, and I'm sure that's probably a massive underestimate. We saw today news of negotiations in Turkey. And the current reality is that there is a negotiation underway, but it's a very unequal negotiation. It's a negotiation under duress. It's a negotiation between a very large nuclear-armed power and a medium-sized power. Now, I have a particular sense of personal affinity for those Ukrainian negotiators. I mean, in a different context and a much less serious one, but I was personally very involved in the negotiations between New Zealand and France at the time that France launched an attack in Auckland Harbour and sank the Rambo Warrior. Now, so I'm only too conscious of the weak position of a country that is trying to negotiate with a powerful Security Council nuclear-armed member with lots of friends and lots of capacity to bring influence and leverage to bear. I think that there is a real risk in this current situation that even if an agreement is reached, it would be an invalid agreement. The Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties and International Law makes it quite clear that a treaty negotiated under duress is void. So I think there's a real worry about the future sustainability of any treaty that is reached in these negotiations if they continue to take place in what we would call an unsafe negotiating environment, a negotiating environment in which the weaker party does not have the protections of a legitimate framework which creates a balance of equality, a balance of negotiating arms with responsible, legitimized negotiating partners. What value you could attach to a commitment to neutrality, what value you could attach to guarantees of security. These are things which I think are very problematic in the absence of a ceasefire and a withdrawal so that Ukraine is not negotiating under duress. Now, what this brings to bear is the fact that if it's possible to negotiate an agreement now, in the light of all this destruction and death, why was it not possible to negotiate the same agreement in January and February of this year and actually forestall what has afflicted so many people? Now, there is very strong practical and academic analysis of, on the one hand, the task of conflict prevention, and on the other hand, the task of conflict resolution. The international community has been actually quite strong and effective in developing mechanisms for conflict resolution. So we have peacekeeping, we have peace operations, we have Secretary General's good offices and mediation activities. We have very well developed and sometimes effective regional organizations with conflict resolution capacity. We have a very effective and good post-conflict reconstruction and development experience and capability. And we have a Security Council which seems to actually like being the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff and cleaning up after a conflict. We have a Security Council which has developed a whole range of both practical but also theoretical models that relate to what happens during a conflict. We have a whole stream of Security Council norms relating to women, peace and security, about children and armed conflict. If the Security Council had put a fraction of the time and effort that is put into all of those strands of work into the prevention side of the equation, the world might be a lot better place, and certainly the situation facing Ukraine might be a lot better than it currently is. There are so few mechanisms available for preventive diplomacy. So there is a tendency when there is conflict on the horizon to wait until the battlefield situation is clear, what is the outcome, or whether there is a stalemate and both sides are exhausted, and then maybe they will be able to reach a conflict resolution. But the cost of being the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, waiting till the end of a conflict, till everyone is exhausted, is exponentially higher. Now, I think we need to be quite blunt and recognize that, in fact, there is a strange human psychology when it comes to international peace and security, which seems to prefer to wait and see. There's a reluctance on the part of politicians and leaders in many, many countries to expend resources, time, energy, to compromise bilateral diplomatic relations in trying to fix problems, because they always hope that maybe the conflict won't happen. Maybe there won't be a war. And if we put all that time and effort in, perhaps it will be wasted. Why don't we wait and see if there is a war, and then we'll clean up afterwards? And I think this is one of the absolute disasters that has been a feature of the 1945 model of peace and security. It did not take enough detail about how you would go about trying to prevent conflict. Now, it's not that the founders of the United Nations failed to recognize this problem. There is a whole chapter of the United Nations Charter called Chapter 6, which is about the peaceful prevention of conflict. In fact, there are more words in Chapter 6 than there are in Chapter 7, which deals with what you do after an aggression has taken place, after a war has broken out. But the evolution of capacity and skills and experience in conflict prevention is significantly a failure of the United Nations as we currently know it. Now, part of the reason I think why people wait for conflicts to be exhausted rather than prevented relates to the political decision-making dynamic in the Security Council. Now, Tatiana touched on this and said and referred to the Russian veto. And of course, Russia does have a veto in the Security Council, and 4 other countries have a veto in the Security Council. But what is not often appreciated is that the veto, if you're a party to a conflict like Russia is at the moment, the veto only applies to Chapter 6 decisions of the Security Council. If you look at Article 27.3 of the Charter, which sets up the veto, it says that when the Security Council is operating under Chapter 6, which is to prevent conflict, any state which is a party to that situation must abstain. So there's actually no veto. There was no veto in January and February of this year that Russia had that would have enabled it to block the Security Council acting in conflict prevention. Now, it's a fascinating and I find furiously annoying feature of the United Nations system that the other members of the Security Council simply refuse to hold Russia accountable in terms of the procedures that are available in the Security Council on this pre-conflict peaceful resolution of disputes. And this time around, they even went so far as to allow Russia to continue as president of the Security Council in the month of February to chair meetings relating to Ukraine, even though there are very clear rules in the Security Council rules of procedure, which require a party with a conflict of interest to recuse themselves from holding the chair. And this is something that happens. I mean, when New Zealand was the president of the Security Council in 2016, it once recused itself from holding the chair. There was the election of Secretary General was coming up. Helen Clark was a candidate, and an issue relating to the election was to be decided in the Security Council. And the New Zealand ambassador decided that it was necessary for him to recuse New Zealand from chairing the Security Council on that occasion. And do you know who ended up chairing that meeting because they were next in alphabetical order? Russia. So Russia actually knows about these rules. It's benefited from these rules. The other members of the Security Council know about these rules. But somehow there's this great failure in the system that says that permanent members should actually be allowed to get away with as much as they possibly can, and that we will use the Security Council as a shouting chamber, as a kind of gladiatorial forum, rather than as a place to solve problems in the way that the founding members of the United Nations in 1945 envisaged. Now, I believe that there were a lot of things that could have been done earlier in the year. Many people were skeptical about whether the Americans were right when they were saying Russia has plans to invade Ukraine. For once, the Americans proved to be absolutely right. And they knew, and everyone else knew, that it was a serious risk. The Americans wouldn't be saying it if it wasn't a serious risk. I mean, even if they were proved wrong, it was still a serious risk. Now, for a start, the Secretary General, where was the Secretary General in terms of exercising his good offices, working either alone or with the Security Council or with other mediating states in order to try and find a solution? And Kennedy referred to the invasion of Iraq by the Americans in 2003. The Secretary General, Kofi Annan, at that time was very active in trying to prevent that conflict actually occurring, traveling to the region, traveling to Baghdad, having meetings. He made himself very unpopular with various people, but he actually went through the process and did all he possibly could. Nothing in this particular occasion. There has been no action at all in the Security Council which could meaningfully be described as action trying to prevent the conflict. So I think that there was an opportunity to set up in January or February a negotiating forum which the Security Council could have set up, in which Ukraine and Russia were both equally able to participate, which the other members of the Security Council would be there, would be a safe political environment because it would be a legitimized forum in which both sides had equal procedural protections. It wouldn't allow for the kind of bullying that is able to take place in a purely bilateral negotiation between unequal parties. Now, I think what else could they have done? The Security Council could have established an investigatory commission to go and look into some of the complaints and issues that were being raised. Security Council could have said, well, in the interim, we will deploy some unarmed, peaceful observers to be on the division lines, which would have provided resources and information and deterrent. They could have had a process of stepping back from immediate confrontation. There are all kinds of tools and devices that have been used in other situations and other times, which could have been brought to bear. But there was a complete poverty of political and diplomatic imagination. So why this failure? Well, let's be honest. In the last 12 months, it's not the only huge failure by the United Nations. United Nations completely missing in action in terms of the awful civil war in Ethiopia between the Ethiopian government and the Tigrayans. Now, the system is clearly in a state of atrophy. The leaders, our leaders, not only in the democracies but elsewhere, I think have forgotten if they ever knew what was envisaged in the package of provisions that were set up in 1945. And they prefer, I think, to use, as I said before, the Security Council as a place where you can have shouting matches instead of finding solutions. Now, clearly, there is work that needs to be done with respect to modifying the veto. I don't believe myself that the abolition of the veto, much as I would like to see it, is going to happen in my lifetime. And as I said, the veto effectively only applies in cases such as the situation in Ukraine. If the Security Council was going to decide to use force, and there's never been any suggestion that the Security Council would decide to actually send troops to attack Russia in self-defense of Ukraine. That this was never going to be like the situation in Iraq, simply because of the nuclear status of Russia. So I think that we need some really significant re-energizing of the 1945 rules. We need to seriously rewrite the practical ways, not the charter, but the practical ways in which Chapter 6 of the charter can actually be used. And we need a whole lot better leadership by the professional officers of the United Nations Secretariat, not only the Secretary General. We've got to stop the business of having the top political leadership of the Department of Political and Peacekeeping Affairs dominated for 30 years now, maybe longer, by one of the Western Security Council permanent members. It's currently a very good United States diplomat who's the Secretary General's chief political advisor. Well, I mean, is it any surprise that the Russians are not going to find that person to be a neutral, balanced, effective, sort of able to act as a mediator? She's a very, very good diplomat, a very nice person, but I think one's got to recognize the fact that these senior leadership jobs need to be able to be available to people who are not part of the P5 culture. I think it brings me back to what I said with my experience with the Rainbow Warrior Affair. In that case, New Zealand and France finally resolved the issue by using the United Nations, by using the good officers role of the Secretary General. It was a Latin American Secretary General. The chief political advisor who was working on the case was an Italian diplomat. I mean, these are the kind of people who are actually able to find middle ground to build the institutional capacity for the parties to negotiate and control the outcome of a mediation, but to do it in a safe way in which neither side feels under duress and neither side is able to take advantage of the other. I think the United Nations, both the Security Council and the Secretariat, do have a future, but it will only be a future that will be with us and available to us if the membership of the United Nations is prepared to stand up and say, we need change, and the case of Ukraine proves we need it now.
Thank you very much, Colin. Amazing. Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Professor Patman, thank you very much for joining us. The floor is all yours. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you to my fellow panelists. I've enjoyed all the presentations and I've learned a lot. In fact, I must confess, I probably should have consulted Colin before I prepared my remarks. But I think we complement each other, actually, but let's see. Kenneth Waltz observed back in 1959, quote, "Wars occur because there is nothing to prevent them," unquote. When Russian President Vladimir Putin announced a special military operation in Ukraine on the 24th of February of this year, the UN Security Council was conducting an emergency late night session chaired by Russia on the worsening crisis. NATO powers and the Biden administration in the United States had repeatedly warned beforehand, for at least 6 weeks beforehand, that Russia was poised to launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, something, of course, that Mr. Putin vehemently denied until 2 days before the actual event. But the timing of Putin's decision to go for a full-scale invasion, remembering, of course, that Russia had already annexed Crimea and been involved in eastern Ukraine since 2014, Putin's decision was a direct slap in the face for the UN, the organization tasked with maintaining international peace and security. In particular, Putin's Ukraine invasion was a fundamental rejection of an international rules-based order that is enshrined in all institutions such as the United Nations and embodied in norms such as multilateralism. As a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, Russia vetoed a UN security resolution on the 25th of February that would have demanded that Moscow immediately stop its attack on Ukraine and withdraw all troops, a move several council members said was deplorable, but predictable. 5 days later, the 193-member General Assembly convened its first emergency session since 1997 and voted overwhelmingly to demand that Russia stop its military offensive and immediately withdraw all of its troops from the Ukraine. But while such assembly resolutions reflect international opinion, they are not legally binding and did nothing to halt the momentum of Putin's invasion. From the beginning of the Russian invasion, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, emphasized, quote, "The protection of civilians must be priority number one," unquote. But the United Nations Security Council has found itself powerless to prevent Russia's assault and bombardment on Ukrainian towns and cities, a tactic which, as we know, has tragically cost the lives of thousands of Ukrainian civilians. By late March, the UN Secretary General was reduced to appealing for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Ukraine, but to date, there has been little real indication that the Kremlin is seriously responding to this call. All this raises the question of whether the United Nations Security Council is fit for purpose in the 21st century and still relevant to the task of preventing war. Let us be very clear, and here I sort of overlap quite a lot with Kennedy. The Putin regime's invasion of Ukraine is a most flagrant violation of the United Nations Charter and an act of aggression that is a crime under international law. The UN Charter prohibits the use of force against territorial integrity or political independence of any state. Amongst other things, it noted the only exceptions to these provisions are self-defense and the use of force authorized by the UN Security Council, neither of which applies in this crisis. Yet all this has been done or committed by a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Russia is in clear breach of its international obligations. Its actions are blatantly against the rules and principles on which the United Nations was founded. Unfortunately, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is only the latest example in the 21st century of permanent members of the UN Security Council challenging the global security architecture and exploiting the frailty of an international rules-based order. In March 2003, the Bush administration bypassed the UN Security Council and launched an illegal invasion and occupation of Iraq. In July 2016, another member of the permanent member of the UN Security Council, China, said it would not accept a legal ruling by an international tribunal in The Hague, which rejected Beijing's claims over strategic reefs and atolls that would give it control over the disputed waters of the South China Sea. And Britain has hinted recently that it may not honor the Good Friday Accord in order to fully implement Brexit. So what can be done to strengthen the international rules-based order so that the world can deal more effectively with challenges like the Russian invasion of Ukraine? New Zealand, in my view, has the chance now, along with other small and middle powers, to make a significant contribution. Since the Second World War, New Zealand has been a firm supporter of the international rules-based order. For New Zealand and most other states in the international system, here I'd probably put the total around about 180, multilateralism provides a voice and an influence on international issues that they cannot achieve on their own. And that is equally true for most states. While New Zealand shares many values and interests with old allies like the United States, UK and Australia, it's also clear that I think Wellington's independent foreign policy cannot rely exclusively on these three states to provide leadership in a multilateral setting. Instead, I think New Zealand must now take steps to work with other like-minded states to build a new global grouping that's dedicated to reinvigorating and strengthening the international rules-based order. It's important that we say enough is enough after the appalling Russian invasion of Ukraine and put in place sturdy barriers to lawless behaviour on the international stage. The current New Zealand government, I think, is in a good position to serve as a bit of a playmaker on the international stage in supporting such an initiative. I'm not suggesting New Zealand should do this unilaterally. I'm suggesting New Zealand should work together with other states which have a big stake in the international rules-based order, which is under a real threat at the moment. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has won global admiration for her compassionate and decisive leadership in relation to both the Christchurch terror atrocity of 2019 and more recently the COVID-19 pandemic. But the push to strengthen the international rules-based order, which I believe could build on the precedent of the Christchurch call, where New Zealand collaborated with a middle power, France, to curb online, an initiative to try and curb online extremism. I think this attempt to strengthen the rules-based order must focus on those elements of the order which is fraying at the moment, those elements that need to be reformed and improved. And here I overlap it with Colin. Realistically, the situation internationally is not going to improve until the permanent members of the UN Security Council lose the privilege of being able to veto any council resolution they do not like. Of course, the P5 members will not wish to give up that privilege, that veto. But that veto was bestowed on them, presumably, at least in part, on the basis that the P5 states could help the UN maintain peace and security. In other words, they were regarded as great powers that should be within the tent rather than outside it, and that they could help deliver to make the world a safer, more secure place. But that assumption, for reasons I've already gone through, has been exploded for some time in the 21st century. The UN Security Council has often been a bystander to some of the most desperate situations in the world, which need both justice and stability. All states, why do I believe that New Zealand, as a small state, and other smaller power and other middle powers now have a chance to make a difference? Why do I say that? Is that just an academic idealism on my part? No, I don't think so. All states in the 21st century, whether they're superpowers or middle powers or small powers, are confronted by problems which are too big for them to solve unilaterally. And of course, we welcome this as New Zealand because multilateral cooperation boosts our sovereignty. The great powers do not see it in such a positive fashion. But the point I'd like to make here is that if so-called great powers cannot or will not recognize that many of the problems we faced internationally have to be resolved internationally. There's no national solution. There's no unilateral solution to transnational terrorism, to, in fact, major security problems, to climate change or COVID-19, etc., etc. If great powers cannot make this paradigm shift on their own and recognize that we do have to move towards international cooperation, it's vital that New Zealand and other small and middle states move from what I call top-down multilateralism, that is where superpowers and such as the United States and perhaps China set the agenda and others follow along, to a more ambitious bottom-up strategic form of multilateralism that champions the international rules-based order and advocates measures like United Nations Security Council reform that will deepen and strengthen the process. In short, we have to grow the international rules-based order to a point where it begins to provide an answer to Kenneth Waltz's question back in 1959. That is, he was saying that wars occur because there's nothing to prevent it. And I very much hope that we can grow the international rules-based order to a point where there are authoritative and credible institutions blocking the path to war and to prevent the sort of unprovoked aggression that we have so horrendously witnessed in Ukraine recently. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, everyone, for this very fascinating and informative session. I thoroughly enjoy your presentations. We have a couple of questions, and I start reading it. I leave it to you, panel, but I kind of see some of the similarities with what your presentation did. So the first one is from Joy. So she's asking question. Good to see you here, Joy, about destiny. So she's asking, what is Russia's future following this conflict, or if you want to call it breach of peace, aggression, or invasion? I mean, what's going to be the future of Russia? And I was wondering, Dr. Kennedy, whether you would like to give some comment on
it? Thank you. I'll keep it short because I don't really have an answer. I think trying to throw a dart into the future at the height of a global crisis like we have is a bit foolhardy. I've heard people say, and we won't talk about the president of the USA, there are others who say that there's a scenario of a lack of support internally for the current Russian president. And so there could be a change of leadership. Personally, I rather doubt that. It would be very interesting to get some idea of genuine Russian domestic support or opposition for this. I'm sure it would be very divisive inside Russia, but it wouldn't be one way or the other. Overwhelmingly, I doubt. I see one question was something to do with the expansion of NATO, and I think that comes into it in terms of the future of Russia. I mean, ideally, I think Colin was alluding to this, and well, actually, Robert as well, there will be some kind of, given the circumstances that we have now and the failure, as Colin pointed out, of Chapter 6, not basically even trying to apply Chapter 6. So now we've got the crisis situation. So the best you can do to get out of a crisis situation, as has happened in the past, is whether it's an invalid negotiation or something that will stop the slaughter and the, as people call it, the absurd conflict that is, it's a 19th century, it's almost Napoleon style, 19th century style. So just to stop that, for obviously humanitarian reasons, but also for legal political reasons, so that you can get some kind of genuine negotiation that follows an immediate ceasefire negotiation. I doubt that Russia is going to lose its influence in the longer term. and there are, I've read arguments that it would be very undesirable that if it did, for reasons that we know very well from 100 years ago. So I hope that there is a short story of ceasefire negotiations to establish a ceasefire. At that stage, surely, as Colin's implying, that's got to be the UN coming in. It isn't European OSCE or obviously NATO or anything. So it would be UN coming in. Obviously neutrality. Finland is an example, and people say, the Ukrainians say it wouldn't be exactly like Finland, but it would be a form of neutrality. And I would only finish on the comment that we also, and we all risk ourselves, not least me, pretending to go into the civilizational and psychological dimension. We've all had our discussions with colleagues about whether the president of Russia has flipped and gone slightly odd. Personally, I don't think so. I think he's taken a rational decision, egregious, violating international law, for which he ought to be responsible one way or another. But I don't think it's going to be otherwise than a negotiated situation, and some kind of neutrality that suits Ukraine, genuinely.
Cool. Thank you very much. Now, I'm going to pose the other question and I would like all the panels, if you have any comments on it, because it's actually a very important point, and it's about nuclear. So much like the reluctance to deploy military force, such as enforcing no-fly zone, do you believe that the high stakes of nuclear force will see Ukraine and global community accept an all-lawful agreement? Any agreement would benefit Russia and see Ukraine concede land, freedom, security, and/or capability. Russia will eventually recover from sanctions and would return to be a threat. On the same lines, would Putin likely escape punishment for war crimes and the crimes of aggression? So there are two questions: is that whether the threats to nuclear can actually make Ukraine and the international community to compromise, and whether Putin would run away, like escape any form of punishment for what he has done. Any members of the panel?
Yeah, I'll go for it.
Cool.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'll have a quick stab at it. I think first of all, the nuclear threat. It's certainly true that NATO and the United States has been wary of the threats made by Mr. Putin. But I think Mr. Putin, and I think I'd probably politely, disagree a little bit with what Kennedy said about Putin. I'm not sure he's completely rational, but I certainly don't think he's suicidal. And I think there's some nuclear saber rattling here. Mr. Putin's decision-making was based on the assumption the West wouldn't get involved. And I think he was trying to reinforce that by making, dark noises about the possible use of nuclear weapons. And the second thing is, I think Mr. Putin made a colossal strategic mistake. The speech he made, I agree with Kennedy. I don't think he's, he has not, how should I put it, lost it mentally. I don't go down that route that he suddenly changed and COVID, he was affected by the isolation of COVID. I don't think so. This is a person living in an information bubble. He has a brutal repressive regime, which is often underestimated in the Western world, which means basically, some of you may have seen some of the interactions that Mr. Putin has with some of his officials. Some of them literally tremble in his presence. So the point I'm making here is that I think he's made a tremendous strategic error and a misjudgment. I think he really did believe that he could overcome Ukraine in a matter of days and be in Kyiv in 2 or 3 days, but that hasn't. Will he get away with what he's done? My own hope, I'm not sure it's going to be realized, is that Mr. Putin is not rewarded for the aggression that he's carried out in any shape or form. And I certainly don't want to see him being able to annex more of Ukraine, because that would be a precedent for the further erosion of the rules-based order. So I don't want to see that. I think there is opposition there is some opposition to Mr. Putin in the agencies he depends on, not least the FSB, and also the military. The military actually, Peter Rutland, the American academic, published a couple of warnings that Putin received before he invaded Ukraine, warning him that it will be catastrophic. So I think the future is looking grim for Mr. Putin. I can't see how the Ukraine is going to agree to the sort of deal he wants. And if he doesn't get what the sort of really substantive payoff from his invasion, given the terrible losses the Russians have sustained in the Ukraine, I can't see how he'll survive politically in Russia. So I think the future for Mr. Putin looks very challenging.
Thank you very much, Rob. Colin, I think the next question is for you. The Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurance on 5th of December 1994 prohibited the Russian Federation, the United Kingdom, and the United States from threatening or using military force or economic coercion against Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, except in self-defense or otherwise in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. Russia's invasion and massacre of Ukrainian people treats that security assurance as it doesn't even exist. So my question is there any point in the UN or anyone else establishing security assurance when a state such as Russia simply choose to ignore such agreements when it suits them?
Well, it's a very important question, but let me just make a couple of quick comments on the first two questions. I think Joy is very wise to raise the question about Russia's destiny. And I think we need to remember that, you know, in the midst of the First World War or even the Second World War, one might have asked, what is Germany's destiny? Germany's destiny was to become a rich, powerful and peaceful country and much respected. We didn't know that, or our parents didn't know that at the time, but that's what happened. I believe that could be Russia's future as well, but it depends on not only what Russia does, but also on what the rest of the international community does as well. Germany transformed because it was treated with respect and treated generously by the victorious allies. Part of their ability to do that was because of the ability to hold accountable the leadership of the Nazi regime. But it wasn't just the Nazi regime. I mean, the Prussians before them were pretty awful and hardly any better than the Tsarists. So, I mean, you know, there was a big reform took place in Germany. I personally think that there are a lot of good people in Russia, a lot of vibrant young entrepreneurial people, and that the future could be good. So there is a lot resting not only on how the transition away from President Putin, as Robert has said, is likely to occur sooner rather than later, but also how quickly the international community is willing to actually step into healing mode, not just healing and compensating for Ukraine, but also, as happened with Germany after 1946, to actually re-engage them in a constructive way. Now, regarding the question about whether Putin will escape accountability, I can't see any way in which he's going to be brought before the International Criminal Court. It's simply not going to happen. There's not going to be a Nuremberg. There's not going to be a victor's peace. So it will be for the Russian people and the Russian elites to find ways to reform themselves in a much more complicated and difficult way. But that takes us to the question about the Budapest Memorandum and the recognition of the Ukraine that was given by Russia in 1994. What I think is most important about that was that it was a commitment that was given to Ukraine in return for Ukraine being willing to give up the nuclear weapons it inherited from the Soviet Union. People forget that in 1994, the Ukraine had the third largest nuclear weapons stockpile in the world. And when Ukraine became an independent sovereign state, it decided it was willing to give that up, but it wanted to trade it for a security guarantee from Russia that would also be backed up by the UK and the United States. Now, the fact that Russia has reneged on that security guarantee is very, very worrying because, and it's particularly worrying if you're a dictator somewhere else in the world and you realize that if you give up a nuclear weapons program, for instance, in return for a security guarantee, how quickly is that security guarantee going to be honored, or will it ever be honored? Unfortunately, we have an almost equally terrible precedent of President Trump reneging on a very important security guarantee given to Iran for Iran being willing to freeze its nuclear program. So both of those steps put together, the Trump decision with respect to Iran, and I mean, Trump breached a Chapter 7 resolution of the Security Council in order to do that. So there's been no accountability with respect to that. So, I mean, what was me most is the message that this has for people who are contemplating giving up or establishing nuclear weapons programs. I think both things develop the high risk of further proliferation of nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction.
Thank you very much. I know we are running out of time, but we do have a couple more questions. Can I ask panelists to just respond to it very quickly so we can actually answer the questions and complete our discussion? So I know Dr. Kennedy referred to NATO, so thank you very much. But we have another question from Gray. Good to see you here, Gray. And he is asking, is there a failure in the belief that military power provides security? Anybody, any member of the panel who would like to comment on it?
I could just say a brief word that sort of overlaps with, I think it's something that Kennedy said earlier. I think Mr. Putin does have an understanding of power in the international arena that belongs to the 19th century. A sort of zero-sum view of the world where it's called great poweritis. The world is, I was struck by the fact that Mr. Putin his attempt to deal with what he said was the Ukraine security problem was trying to work with the Americans through diplomacy rather than sitting down with President Zelensky. Yeah, so I think that Mr. Putin, if you look at his situation, the reason I'm so pessimistic about Putin is because Russia's economy was already struggling before the invasion. And so I think, yes, in terms of security, the idea that military power doesn't actually always convert into political influence. And I think what we're seeing in the Ukraine is a classic example of where Russia has used military power and not only lost any influence, even in Russian-speaking areas in Ukraine, such as Kharkiv, but also its position internationally has been very seriously compromised. So I think the question is a good one. Power is multifaceted in the 21st century.
Kennedy, did you want to comment on it?
Just very quickly to agree with what Robert has said, but also to draw a distinction, I think, between not just WMDs, but especially nuclear weapons and conventional weapons, even if they are unusual conventional weapons, because, I mean, we go back to, and Colin with the Rainbow Warrior in the 80s, and go back to the New Zealand Prime Minister of the 80s, who declared publicly, globally, nuclear deterrence and reliance on nuclear weapons makes a country less safe than more safe. And that gets us onto the whole issue of the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, and New Zealand's leading role in that. But it was the P3, the Western P3, and the P5, and NATO as well separately, and separately again the P5, including Russia and China, have all made statements opposing the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. So it's almost, if you like, the veto of nuclear weaponry.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. And I think we should have another panel just talking about nuclear and the problems it creates. But our next question, very quickly, is that the UN is dependent on the willingness of its members to bring pressure on members who act aggressively against other members. What is stopping members who support rules-based order from acting? Why is the United Nations not be able to follow its own procedures against aggressive members?
I don't want to talk too much. Somebody else. I mean,
Colin, would you like to?
The coalition of the willing is not the answer.
Yeah.
It has to be council sanctioned. But Colin.
This comes back to the question about whether or not the use of military force is actually the solution to the problem. I mean, underlying the question is, why don't a whole group of member states of the UN get together and use force against aggressors? And that was the theory that was put forward in 1945, that there would be a legitimized use of force under Chapter 7 of the Charter in order to push back against breaches of the peace and aggression. Now, what the Ukraine case shows is that that doesn't work if the aggressor is a nuclear-powered state, is a nuclear-armed state, because nobody is willing to take the risk of actually invading them to stop the aggression. So you're then forced into a situation where you have to negotiate solutions. And it comes back to my original point. If you're going to negotiate solutions, better to start negotiating them before the fighting starts rather than after the fighting has killed thousands of people and caused millions of refugees. So I think I would prefer to sort of shift away from the model that we ought to look for structures in the UN system that will use force. I don't think it is ever really going to be the best solution.
Thank you very much, Colin. We have one more question. I know it's very short a time and it's a big topic, but anybody who would like to answer that. So, Kiara, what do you think will the UN strategy be to address the refugee crisis, specifically in regard to asylum seekers, mainly from Middle East, like Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, now that there is also a growing number of asylum seekers from Ukraine? Do you think UN will take leadership over this issue? How would they address this issue? Anybody would like to have a guess? No?
I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding in the question. I don't think the people from Ukraine are asylum seekers. Asylum seekers are people who feel that they are being persecuted by their own government and that they want to escape from their country. These are people who want to be in their country, who love their country. They want to stay in their country. It's just that they're in danger of their lives. So my assumption is that most of them, if there was to be peace tomorrow, would love to go back to Ukraine. So that this is a kind of hopefully a temporary phenomenon, and these people need to be looked after as guests rather than sort of asylum seekers, and treated with, unfortunately, asylum seekers are treated quite badly in most parts of the world with bureaucratic and legal processes and that sort of thing, usually assuming that they're trying to find a backdoor way into a richer country. And I think that's a false assumption.
Thank you very much. Tatiana, last word is yours.
Thank you. I just want to emphasize Mr. Colin Keating's words. Yes, I do believe that Ukrainian people, they're looking for some short-term refuge, but in general, the Ukrainian spirit is quite strong, and they all looking forward to come back to their homes. And I do have in my own family, I had my brother, he was working in Poland where all this started, and his family managed to cross the border to Poland. But after 10 days, they whole family came back because, and there are other cases that people do coming back to Ukraine, even under those terrible circumstances, because people do want their country, our country back, our normal country back. So I think it's a short-term refuge that, yeah. Thank you.
Sorry, I have to make a correction. So Aidan just corrected. It says it was meant about the refugees from the Middle East who are staying in the Ukraine. Apparently, Russia has evacuated tens of thousands of them. In the last by train they have evacuated. So the question was not generally about asylum seekers, but about the Middle Eastern asylum seekers who stayed in Ukraine and now they're evacuated by Russia. That's comment? Yeah, okay. Sorry, but hopefully we can get back to you. Thank you very much. Namahinui Katoa, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Vaji, for this fantastic opportunity, and have a wonderful evening, everyone. Thank you. I learned a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's a very comprehensive discussion, and we learned a lot actually. And also, I would like to thank you for participants for active engagement, and also kind appreciations passed to us while the conversation was going on. Namahinui to our speakers for wonderful contribution. They given comprehensive information, learning, insights, and the concerns. They all provide a deep understanding of the issue and showed how important it is to actively participate in this conversation. Thank you very much. And I hope everyone has takeaways which you could use in many ways with your role in the community, and look forward to engaging with you. And would appreciate your feedback from via emails. Namahinui to UNANZ Wellington team for their time to organize this conversation. No reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia pātora, nohora mai. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.